Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hi, welcome everybody to Points of View on Teachers Talk Radio today. We've got a couple of really good stories that we're gonna discuss on this autumnal day, because it is getting a bit like that now. Everybody got the heating on?
Nope.
Good hardy souls. Yeah.
Have you?
Have I? Occasionally. I have to admit we've strayed into the odd blast, but nothing much. You understand? Not a permanent fixed heating situation yet.
Fair dues.
So yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to start it off with the announcement this week of the government's intention to introduce a year 8 reading test. So as I understand it, it's been reported in various media outlets would sit in year 8 specifically to test their ability to read. And this is not to be published on a school-by-school basis. So in other words, obviously a school's own score wouldn't be published for all to see, but that it would be published as a national score. So, you know, presumably then people could say either reading's getting better or it's getting worse. So that's the story. Who wants to start with this? Lucy, perhaps?
I can do, yeah. I have a lot to say on this, actually. So for a start, I began my time working in education in primary schools. And for 1 year, I worked with a year 6 class. And I did reading with those year 6 students who were really far behind the others. And they were already lost. They were already so far behind. You couldn't see how they would catch up. We read and read and read. They didn't like the books. They didn't want to do it. So I think there's that to point out. We do need to acknowledge that the children in the UK are the best readers in the Western world. So I think we're behind Russia, Singapore and Hong Kong. But, you know, out of all of Europe, the American countries, you know, we are the highest readers, but we obviously have some children left behind. I think personally that we need to, that it's too late by the time they get to year 8. I can't see them engaging. I don't know what the books are. We used to use something called Wellington Square, which was for older children, and I googled it, and it's up to age 13. But even in year 6, the kids thought they were trying to engage. Do you get what I mean? They could see through it. They could see through it. It was simple language, trying to be dressed up as sort of older stories. If you look at it, I mean, you know, we're all of a sort of certain age or era or thereabouts. When I was a child, I was an avid reader. I never stopped reading from, you know, as the minute I didn't have something to do, I had a book in my hand. But we had to read a lot of the older books, a lot of the classics, a lot of the Enid Blyton. There's never been a better time for young people to read the types of books, the range, the stories. I mean, it's phenomenal what's out there. And you know, you've never had less engagement in reading in kids. So even the ones who can read really well, you know, really good readers, they don't want to read. They have no interest in it at all. So I'm going to step aside so that someone else can have a go, but I still have more to say.
No, well, that's absolutely fine, because there's a lot of really good stuff there. Tarjinder, what do you think?
I mean, I can see from both perspectives what the issue is here. You know yourself that I don't refrain from sort of criticising unions when I think they're being unfair, or when I think they're, you know, sort of going off on a tangent politically. However, I think some of the points they've made in terms of accountability are, you know, do resonate, and I do think we need to, and while I have no issue with there being accountability measures whatsoever, I do think we need to think about what that let's be realistic, it will become an accountability measure. However, at the same time, my question would be, this isn't just about schools and tests, this is about actual training, because how much training secondary teachers really get when it comes to reading and the importance of it and how to promote it within their own subjects, and the kind of reading that would be useful, like even down to say sort of basic stuff like vocabulary training, how much cognitive load is being implemented on some of these children, so they may even come up okay-ish, but actually the expectations expand so much, and if you don't have that knowledge and understanding and then the ability to apply, actually I would say at any age and any stage, the willingness to read and the capacity to feel successful while reading can diminish quite easily. And I would argue, for example, now if I was asked straight away, like as part of like my role, or whatever it is, I need to read these like dense, heavy legal texts where I've not got the knowledge, I don't have the vocabulary, I'm sure I would pretty much go off reading quite quickly if I had to do that on a regular basis, Of course it would happen, because I just wouldn't understand enough of what I'm reading. And imagine that day in, day out. That's got to be frustrating. So I do for some of the children as well. But equally, I'm not saying that people are doing this on purpose. However, I can see how it can be quite easy for children who are already behind to slip, and also for children who may be sort of average readers to slip as well in that situation. We've got to sort of really think through the teaching and learning aspects. Just sticking a test in isn't going to make the difference. That's all I'm saying. If you just stick it in, all you're doing is weighing the pig. You see what I mean? Like that's all you're doing is you keep weighing it, but you're not actually thinking about why is it not fattening, and it's not fattening because you're not giving it what it needs. The sustenance. So I would say this cannot just be we're going to introduce a test. The government needs to think more clearly in terms of the overall reasoning behind it, because that's something that I don't feel like really came across in that article, and maybe it will come across when they do actually give more information about it and give more information, because I know that there is now funding for Key Stage 3 reading, which there wasn't sort of prior. That's like the next sort of stage for the English hubs. So I do think there's other things that are going on behind the scenes, but I think they need to present a holistic picture, because otherwise actually the criticisms that are already coming out may very well become true, which is that you've given us an accountability measure but no real means to meet that.
Well, of course, they say that it isn't an accountability measure. I know you've said that you think it will be. The argument that as I understand it, that's put forward is that because it isn't published, or it won't be published on a school-by-school basis, it's more about, if you like, a benchmark for the nation, so that the government and the country as a whole can then reflect upon whether reading is improving or not. Now, whether that's right, or I know some people are concerned, aren't they, that yes, okay, this government might say that, but what about future governments? Will they, use the information to be another stick to beat, teachers with? And obviously that's a view I think that the unions are concerned about, that another accountability measure isn't necessarily going to add anything. But Lucy, you had quite a bit more that you wanted to add, I think.
Well, I did. So, I mean, I said about how I worked with year 6. I worked with year 3. I did something, I can't remember what it stood for, but it was called SAIL, and it was something like Somerset Assisted Intervention in Literacy, something like that. And I used to sit with these children and they would have to write a sentence, however they would write a sentence, and then cut it up. And it was all about, but it was a focus on reading, because they then had to jumble it up, then put all of their words back in order. Then I would rewrite the sentence how it should be, and they'd have to do the same thing, because it wasn't just the reading of the words. Some of the problems that children have from such an early age is even their comprehension of the spoken and written word, let alone actually just reading the words. So, we would take a word and cut it into pieces and then rebuild it. So there was so much to do even at that age. And I can't imagine that those children, by the time they got to age 12 or 13, wouldn't fail the next stage of reading test at year 8. And so you have to ask, well, what do you do at that point? What do you do with that information? This child has come, in the bottom sort of quartile or whatever. How do we deal with that? Well, of course, you're going to then have to put in some sort of intervention. And as Tarjinder said, it's not just about reading. It is about the whole vocabulary. It's about understanding. I mean, I had children who couldn't say words, you know, who literally couldn't say words like caterpillar and things. So, you know, getting them to read those words, even when they're older, they just avoid it. They've learned how to work within the confines of what they can do. We spend so long, don't we, saying to kids, you've got to be in your lessons. It's really important. You can't be late because you were late for and now I would imagine that we'll be saying, right, as a result of that, we're going to get Mrs. So-and-so from, you know, or employ some HR or some TAs or whatever, and they're going to do reading with the children, and then they're going to be taken out their classes, and 1 minute it's not good to be out of your class, but the next minute French doesn't matter, or whatever, because, you know, you've got to do some reading, and they're going to be embarrassed, they're not going to want to engage in it, reading is already been left behind for them by that point. So I feel I don't see what will be done with it other than a measure like Tarjinder said, just weighing the pig, you know, unless we're going to put things in. And I'd rather see if there's money going into it. I'd rather see that going in with really extra resources at those youngest age groups where children are still very, very willing to try. And the last thing I'd say for the moment is that are some people just not going to be able to do everything that we wish they could do? You know, if you had a physical disability, we wouldn't just keep trying to get you to run until you're caught up with everyone else. What we want is for children to be able to function in life, and if they can use social media, and if they can read you know, something on a job application, or, you know, sort of the very basics of reading, are we just putting kids through unnecessary stress because we think that they should be like all the others?
At AQA, we work with the UK's largest teacher network to shape the future of assessment. With teachers for students, we ask questions today that matter tomorrow.
Get a head start on your fresh start with Bloomsbury Education. With 30% off all our books till the end of September, this back-to-school sale is your chance to stock up on CPD titles, classroom resource banks, lesson ideas, and practical solutions to every teacher's pain points. Browse titles on sale from the Like a Ninja series, The Week Junior, and Let's Talk Picture Books, perfect for the new school year. From leadership to inclusivity and maths to mental health, Bloomsbury Education has books for every step of your teaching journey. Welcome back to school at bloomsbury.com/back-to-school sale.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Capel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to capelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles.
I mean, it's some interesting thoughts there. I'm not sure from what I've read or understood whether young people themselves would receive the scores. I don't know. I don't even know if the school would receive the scores. I presume that at some point they would, or they'd be aware of them, but I don't know for sure because I haven't even read that. Because there are already national tests which are undertaken by a sample of young people, and they are to gauge overall achievement and anchor achievement at GCSE. So it gives a kind of baseline, but they aren't reported back to the schools or the individuals that take the test. They're just used as part of the process of setting standards for GCSE and beyond. So I think there are some questions to answer. Having said all of that, I think there is, well, two things. I think there's an awful lot that goes on in secondary schools at year 7 and 8 already, an awful lot. That doesn't mean that we should ever accept a young person being in a situation where they can't read, or certainly they struggle to read by the end of year 8, because if you do, it's effectively cutting off your life chances in terms of many careers. It's a serious impediment to progress. So I wouldn't want that to happen.
No.
But I'm just saying, Lucy, sorry, I'll please come back in. But I was just going to say that I think you're right to say that the test in itself won't resolve anything. It's what you do as a result of that that's resolving it, and that in itself isn't clear. It's a bit of a, well, okay, so what? Because we kind of know what the reading ages are mostly of young people at the end of year 8. The big question is, for those that aren't achieving the right standard or a standard that they're capable of, what is it that we can do about it? Sorry, you wanted to come in.
No, not necessarily. I was, like I said, I wasn't trying to say that, that you ever write anybody off. But we know that actually ongoing development, very often I think you're in secondary education as well, aren't you, Carl? But I can't say I have, and I worked predominantly with either children with learning difficulties or who had issues with access, who, all those. I've worked with so many of those children, but I don't ever remember working with anybody who really couldn't read, to the point of just couldn't read, unless they had really severe special needs, in which case, like I said, they may never be able to read to a sort of a full standard that you would hope for them to be able to. But I taught maths, so that was my subject. I taught it to very small focused groups of students in various settings, but we chose an exam board for our maths exam that had their easiest reading requirements, and that was a huge decision to make, because we didn't want reading. I was nothing to do with this. This was the head of department, but that we didn't want language or reading to be a barrier to being able to do maths. And I remember she used to say that, and I just think, well, I couldn't see how it could be any different till I did some tutoring, and there were students I sort of tutored who were doing other exam boards, and I realised just how wordy some of the other exam boards were, and there may only have been 20 questions instead of 26, but my word, they were, even I had to sort of rethink how to approach how I taught those things around the questions. So it is a huge barrier, but I'm not sure, I just don't think we'll ever get all children up to that age, up to that standard that we want. I think that there have been great progress made in, reading ability. I think phonics has obviously played a huge part in that. Most children can read well. I just think that the intervention needs to be put in place much sooner, because you can already identify by year 2 easily. You can identify the students, the children who are going to go on to sort of keep falling behind as they get older. And I'm sure social media must improve their reading skills, because they have a reason to want to read, don't they?
Depends what the trouble is, that what they're reading isn't necessarily particularly challenging.
And it's what they need. That's all they,
I agree, but I think that when it comes to the actual reading, and I think one of the things that one of the key debates we've still not had is, what do we really think the minimum should be? I think sometimes the problem is that we work backwards and it makes sense, but ultimately, like Lucy's saying, not everybody is going to end up with becoming like somebody who's like a literature specialist, okay, or somebody who like reads all these different types of texts and understands them. For example, there's already a bias towards fiction compared to non-fiction, okay, and if you stop and think about it, the vast majority of the reading they do in secondary is, and yet the opposite is true in primary. So there's a debate there about, actually, because the genres were not outlined, and because traditionally we focused more on fiction rather than non-fiction in primary, is that also an issue? I think we need to look at this more holistically and go, what is the real barrier here? What is the problem? What are these children facing, and why? And particularly when you look at boys, for example, is that sort of focus on fiction, is that imbalance there, and does that have an impact? There's nothing wrong with asking these questions and tweaking the curriculum. We've tweaked the curriculum so much at times for the right reasons, I think, at times, in terms of how we look at developing vocabulary over time, sequencing the curriculum. I don't see why we shouldn't go ahead and ask other questions just because they haven't been answered already. Also, what does minimum look like? What is actually acceptable in each of these year groups, as opposed to like, everybody needs to get great depth. Okay, but what do we really think about comprehension? What do we really expect? Because there's been a sort of hangover from previous accountability systems, particularly in year 2. And we know a lot more now about both reading and writing, the relationship with them in terms of phonics, reading fluency, and actually that sort of hangover of year 2 tests. I mean, I do still have a beef about the fact they're still being published, quite frankly, because I think they should have been significantly changed given all the knowledge that we've acquired over the last sort of 10, 15 years in particular. I don't see why they are in the format they're in. If you look at the year 1 curriculum and then the year 2 curriculum, and the leap you're expecting certain children to make within that time frame, is that really reasonable? Because I look at it now and I start to think actually what they're expecting in year 2 might actually have been better in year 3, for example. Do you see what I mean? Like, actually, is year 2 the reasonable place to put that? Because the emphasis then becomes about answering reading comprehension questions, about writing those particular types of answers, as opposed to something like reading fluency, which is what you'd really want them to spend their time on. The gap. Phonics comprehension, it's phonics fluency comprehension. That is the model, and that's the model that makes the most sense. And yet, if you were to go down a certain route, it's still there. And, the quid pro quo for the reception baseline was always they would get rid of the year 2 tests. And they're like, no, we're going to publish them anyway. Well, then what is it that you actually believe? And I'd say that criticism towards Conservatives as well as Labour is like, are you sure you know what you're talking about then? Because actually we're now getting to a situation where I think there are practitioners on the ground who actually have a greater understanding of what the testing should be compared to the people who are setting the tests themselves, because they still think reading is a set of skills, by the way. That is still the thinking behind this. It is ridiculous. Like, we know it's knowledge, we know it's vocabulary, we know these things. So, for example, the fact that the Key Stage 2 tests are not aligned with the curriculum, and there's plenty of ways in which they could be aligned with the curriculum, with known vocabulary. So what are you testing? I did write a what are you actually testing? You're testing something that we're not teaching. And for me, that is a problem in itself, because you don't do that in other tests. We don't do that for SPAG. We don't do that for maths. And yet what you want to know is what have they read generally, which we don't have any real control over. Also, we've just got to accept the fact that for some children, school is the place where they will gain the majority of the knowledge that they will get, and they won't be getting tons and tons of it elsewhere. So if you're testing that, you're testing their home life. And I don't agree with testing a child's home life on a test. You should be testing what they've actually been taught, what they could have acquired, because again, are we getting children to fail things because we're testing them on something that's not there? And in some cases, in certain schools, I know it's not going to be there. I know they won't have done more than what we've taught them. But if they've learnt what we taught them and you were to test them on that, and can they understand that, you might find a bit more of a positive outcome there. And also in terms of the impact on teaching and learning and making it sort of more relevant to the children, that would make sense. Let's stop and think about it. You're doing a test at the end of the year and you're reading things that you've never, possibly a genre you've not been taught, or possibly a whole bunch of knowledge, and then you're being assessed based on that. And you know that even from a young age, that's what's happening. Well, there's something not quite right about that particular reading.
It depends what the test is for, Tarjinder, I suppose. If the test is to bring schools to account, then you're right. It is then unfair to be testing things that are at home, that are learned at home. If the test is to simply get an idea of how well young people can comprehend, and you're right, I think it's a good point to raise the distinction between coding, which of course links very much to phonics, and between fluency, which links much more to comprehension. If the aim of the test, though, is to get a good understanding of how well young people at a certain age can do those things in order to inform policy making for the future, well, then that's, I suppose, a different thing. But if I may, I just wanted to broaden it a little bit, because there is quite a history in the secondary sector of initiatives to give meaning to year 8, because year 8 is often known, and has been throughout all of my years in education, as a bit of a Cinderella year, in that it's neither in year 7, young people are very keen to make, most young people are very keen to make their mark, and it's all new and fresh. In year 9, they're often already thinking about options and career paths, and they're encouraged to make decisions based on that. And 10 and 11 they're clearly focused on GCSE, but year 8 can be a little bit of an in-between year. And so there was a report by Ofsted over 20 years ago now, called Key Stage 3, the wasted years. And it raised this question, made a variety of proposals. And of course, what we also must remember is there was a time when Key Stage 3 had SATs. Yeah. So at the end of a Key Stage 3 stage, young people would sit SATs in English, maths, and in fact science at one stage as well. So there's a history of this sort of thing. But year 8 specifically, there is a point or a purpose to giving something for young people to focus on, because there is a danger in year 8 that young people drift, and schools don't put much attention on year 8 because they've got, greater priorities. And in that sense, the reading test, yes, it addresses the issues of reading, but I think it also is an attempt to address the issue of year 8 in secondary schools and its potential to be a bit of a fallow year. So I think there are two things going on there. But any more thoughts about this overall?
Well, you make some really good points, but I'd like to do a little bit of reading now, because I want to tell you about our sponsors. So Hachette Learning. This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit www.hachetteLearning.com to explore the full range of titles. Also, the Chalk and Talk podcast. If you're looking for another great education podcast, check out Chalk and Talk with Anna Stokey. Anna is a passionate advocate for evidence-based maths education for students of all ages. On her podcast, she talks about everything from effective teaching methods and how-to guides for teaching maths facts to tips for evaluating research show claims. She brings on top-notch guests, educators, researchers and policymakers, and discusses issues that directly impact teachers and students. Chalk and Talk is for anyone interested in education. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. And I want to talk to you about AQA, because AQA know teachers are the real experts in the classroom. That's why they work closely with teachers like you, combining your insight with their assessment expertise to create resources, tools, training and guidance that genuinely make a difference. They're the UK's most chosen assessment organisation, so chances are you already know their work. And as we head into a new school year, AQA are focused on helping teachers feel supported and ready. If you want to find out more about how they're working with teachers like you, just head to their website or search AQA. We work with experts. So what I was going to say, you're absolutely right about year 8. And of course, it coincides with the height of, or the sort of reaching the crescendo of behaviour issues as well. So you've got that lack of focus, that lack of importance, and also all the things that are going on with sort of young people at that age with their bodies changing and things. And so I completely agree that it would be good to have something. I would have thought maybe year 8 SATs or something, though, rather than the reading, because they need something to focus on. And if it's just a test that comes along and they sit and do it and then it goes away again, and if we're not certain that they're going to have the results published, we're not certain they'll be told the results themselves, then it's still not much of a focus for that year. It's not going to be a year's lasting focus. Whereas maybe if you did something in year 8 that was more SATs like, I personally don't think that children get half as worked up about SATs by themselves. It's their teachers and it's their parents that get them worked up about it, for those who do get worked up about it. And so I think by year 8, I think a lot of that will have dissipated, because parents are less engaged, naturally less engaged, not just, bad people, but, you hand over responsibility for your children's learning to your children the older that they get. So I don't see a problem with having some sort of test to give that focus. So I think that's a good idea, but I'm not sure a reading test does it. I'm not sure I'm really behind this test without more information about where it leads to, but I'll stand on my hill and preach that any intervention, any money that goes into it should go in when they're younger, when they're more receptive, and don't leave it till when they're 12 or 13, and you can't get them to listen to anything.
So I think from that, Lucy, you've definitely said that you're not really a big fan of this initiative. That would be fair comment.
Yeah,
Tarjinder, are you a big fan?
I just need to know I just need to see the plans more fully to get behind it. Like I said, I don't have a problem with testing. I don't have a problem with accountability. I genuinely think there were massive issues with the lack of accountability when I was growing up. And I was lucky I went to a school where I did succeed, but there are clearly lots and lots of people who didn't in similar circumstances. So I didn't see days for an awful lot of children. But also in terms of the education system in general, unless you know what's going on, you can't set that standard. And I think we do need to have a higher standard. But if it's just going to be a stick to beat schools with no real thinking behind what it is that's causing the issue, without thinking more widely about this, I don't think it will work. And I don't see the point of testing for the sake of testing. All it does is undermine tests that we already have. We already have people who are against testing, full stop. And I don't agree with them, because I think that tests can be useful. However, I'm not going to advocate for a test that I think will lead to something positive, because I'm not so ideologically wedded to the idea of testing that I'd be like, every test is great, like it's got to have a wider purpose. And like I said, I want to see what the curriculum and assessment review people are saying as well, and their thinking behind why it is that some of these gaps are opening up, what the cause is. And like I said, I'm not saying it's just about secondary. It may very well be that we need to think about the primary curriculum and how we're going about things there as well, and maybe matching it up more closely so that the children do have more of a chance to succeed. Like I said, if it means more non-fiction across the board in terms of, like teaching those kind of tests, if that in itself would solve the problem, then I don't see what the issue is there. Like, I think we'd be more than willing to do that. Ultimately, those of us who work in primary don't want to send our children off to secondary just to see them fall behind because of a decision we could make to support them.
Yeah, it is unfortunately true, and a lot of research backs this up, that for many young people, the transition between primary and secondary leads to either a plateauing or regressing in their overall progress. Having said all of that, you've always got to factor in, as both of you have mentioned, age, and when children hit puberty and when their lives change and they change, their priorities change, and it's inevitable that not that they go backwards, but that they have a different way of thinking about themselves and their education. So there is that to factor in. But yeah, I'd agree. I'm not against it. I think it has many merits to it, and I think that it comes from a good place. I don't think it's a panacea, and I think there are many things that would need to be clarified in order to better understand whether it was something that would lead to real intervention and real change and more resources for the priorities, which should be, I think, absolutely to make sure that every child is given every opportunity to enjoy and flourish in their reading. Shall we go on to the second story that we're focusing on today? So that was a story that was reported in the Daily Mail a few days ago. And to outline for those who may not have heard it, it's a story of a really concerning incident that happened in a school where a senior member of staff was assaulted by a young person who was scaling a fence, and the member of staff was on duty at the time and tried to desist the young person from scaling the fence, only for the young person to then turn on that member of staff and start attacking them. This situation was made more graphic by the fact that it was inevitably filmed by other students who were present on the scene, and then that video was circulated to all and sundry. So that's become something on YouTube and other other media platforms. So who wants to start?
Well, I can. So I think that schools are becoming more dangerous places for teachers, for other students. I would imagine. Was I right in thinking that student was already in trouble for something, or have I?
Well, the big
Have I?
failing offence. I assume that they were doing it for a reason, but I don't know what.
Yeah, I seem to think that there was a reason they were trying to get away. Anyway, you know, there are huge safety issues, I think, because actually it wasn't just the teacher. There were other students who were trying, I think, to get that student away from the teacher or to pull the teacher away, who also could have got injured. I personally would think that if a student tries to scale a fence, I don't think I'd have intervened. And I did see it because my room was right next to the car park and one of the exits, and kids quite easily got over those fences. They'd throw their bag over, shimmy up, and over they'd go. But report it to somebody else. It's not safe, because actually if you even tried to pull that child down and they break their leg, you're in trouble. I'm not blaming the teacher at all, but I think this is a lesson to all of us, to be honest with you, that there's very few occasions where the student will come down and say, yeah, you're right, actually, sir, I shouldn't have done that. So I really feel for that teacher. I hope that he's okay. I understand, was it in the comments he was an older teacher as well?
Well, there's a suggestion in the media from the report that I looked at that he was a teacher that was, in quotes, getting on a bit.
Yes.
What precisely that means, I don't know, because one person's getting on a bit is not another person's. But leaving that question to one side, yes, he was probably more experienced, I would say.
Yeah. So I think it's a really unfortunate incident, but I think we have to, as staff, I think that staff have to think about themselves as much as anything. If somebody's halfway up over a fence, I think it's safer to let them go, to report it back. Usually teachers have walkie-talkies and things these days, don't they? Report it back, and then, you can get either the police out if you feel that they're a danger to themselves or to somebody else, or members of senior leadership can go out and try and track that student down and try and talk them into coming back into the site. But a really horrible incident.
Tarjinder, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Lucy. But I mean, it's hard though, isn't it? Because we don't have the context again, in these stories. So while I would agree that, in the first instance, actually, if a child's that heightened, but if you are an experienced member of staff, you've worked at that pupil a number of times, and actually they have, but on this occasion they just turn. I can understand that, for example, it may be that this is like the 5th time this child has done this, and 4 out of 5 times, fine, they calmed down with that member of staff and they were able to move along. And this time they just flipped, and we've got to understand that actually sometimes it's, with the best intention of the world, we cannot make another person consistent towards us, like their feelings and their may very well be, there's more to this. Agree. The whole filming of it, but it's also the disturbing thing, you had children involved as well who were trying to pull the pupil off the teacher, and how distressing it is in that situation for those pupils. I don't know what you can do. If people take these kind of, I think there does need to be something to be said about actually we shouldn't be allowing these kind of videos to be posted. Partly because I think it just desensitizes the pupils themselves to this. And I don't want pupils to be desensitized to this. It should actually be quite shocking if a teacher's attacked in some way, and that's the right, same thing if it was your parent, same thing, I don't want them to think, well, it's just kind of, I don't want it to be normalized. And also for the pupil themselves, how can they understand? Fair enough, we all make mistakes, we all mess up, we all do these things. That I don't want this pupil to be, we don't want them to be sort of tarred forever with this. Just in terms of the pupil themselves, everything stays on. Sorry, there's massive, somebody just decided to start beeping wildly outside my door. Do you know what's happened there? But equally for the pupil themselves, these things stay on the media for a long time. It's about them long term too. I do think there needs to be more to be said, that these kind of videos need to be taken down almost immediately. They just need to be, and there needs to be some consequence if you're the people that's actually uploaded it. as in it's just not acceptable whatsoever. And I think there's enough, sort of tracking that goes on now. And I know that there's VPNs and things like that, but still, ultimately we would have a rough idea of like who would have been in that playground, and actually you've just got to get that sorted. But actually it shouldn't be. I wasn't happy about the fact that I was still able to watch it, and I didn't want to watch it.
No.
And I think this is part of a wider trend of sort of videos, and it's not just about schools, it's like out there, like if you just look at what happened with the, so there was 2 videos, and of course I know this is slightly going off on a tangent, but I think it's in a similar vein where we're sort of getting desensitized, where you had the Ukrainian refugee over in the States whose video then went viral, and then also the Charlie Kirk one, which again, I refuse to watch both. But it does concern me, this kind of desensitization to these this kind of violence is in itself provoking more violence. Like people don't see it for what it actually is, and we don't have the watershed in the same way. And yet, the psychological elements of this have not changed. Children watching violence does disturb them. We've known this for a long time now. We've known since the Bobo doll experiments, etc. Like we already knew it, but we've already had confirmation of this time, and we just need to see the impact that domestic violence has on young children or on children in general as well, to know that this is not okay. So why post it? Why think there are times when people try and make it out to be something slightly different, and I'm like, no, this is still an adult who's supposed to care for you, and to watch them have violence done to them or to be in that environment is not safe. And I think we need to think about that side of things too, which is, yes, we need to report, but where is the dividing line?
At AQA, we work with the UK's largest teacher network to shape the future of assessment. With teachers for students, we ask questions today that matter tomorrow.
Get a head start on your fresh start with Bloomsbury Education. With 30% off all our books till the end of September, this back-to-school sale is your chance to stock up on CPD titles, classroom resource banks, lesson ideas, and practical solutions to every teacher's pain points. Browse titles on sale from the Like a Ninja series, The Week Junior, and Let's Talk Picture Books, perfect for the new school year. From leadership to inclusivity and maths to mental health, Bloomsbury Education has books for every step of your teaching journey. Welcome back to school at bloomsbury.com/back-to-school sale.
Over 7,500 primary schools are already using Compel Primary to boost confidence in teaching foundation subjects. Our expert-created curriculum planning, lessons and CPD are here to support and upskill you, whether you're a subject lead or classroom teacher. If you've got knowledge gaps in art, music, computing or beyond, we've got you covered. Head to compelprimary.com and empower your teaching today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly this stuff sensationalizes violence, and it does so for reasons that benefit the media organizations rather than young people or schools. And immediately you think, what's the reputation of the school following a video like this? Because, of course, it is set out of context. For all we know, this is, a highly unusual event in that school. But that school will be having to defend itself against the accusation that now behaviour is out of control and so on and so forth. Similarly, I agree with you. There is a big question about the, advisability of young people having the freedom to simply post these things, as they do frequently online, particularly on YouTube. And anyone that cares to look, and there are many young people who do, will find that on YouTube there are many films of playground fights and other upsetting incidents, because some people find that entertaining. And of course, then the media will, in the same breath almost, certain sections of the media will be reporting stories like this where they'll be sensationalizing the violence and saying, isn't this dreadful? Obviously, the world's going to hell in a handcart. But then on the other hand, within a day, they will be criticising a school for being too strict, or rules, or having rules that then parents don't like. You know, we've heard of many times of schools that have been subject to petitions and, you know, parents complaining that the schools are being run like prisons and so on and so forth. Well, in fact, both of those things are not really a proper and fair representation of what happens in schools. In reality, rules rules give structure. But there is also, of course, well, incidents like this are concerned are rare. Incidents which are of probably more moderate in nature, you know, a moderate level of violence and a moderate level of verbal abuse are very common in secondary schools. I would imagine increasingly so in primary, and that is a great concern. And nobody would say that that's a good thing. So, you know, it raises it's several questions. I mean, for me, there still must be a red line. No person, no member of staff should ever go to work in a school feeling unsafe. No member of staff should ever go to work in a school feeling that they might be attacked or abused. That's got to be a red line. And irrespective of the debate about the reasons why these young people are feeling violent, that is just unacceptable, never will be acceptable, and cannot be justified. And the consequences of it must be certain, and they must be quick, and it must be clear that if you do that, you will not benefit from it, far from it, because otherwise teachers, you won't have any teachers left. You've already got, I think the NAS did a report. I think it was the NAS did a report last year or earlier this year, where they were saying that I think 41% of teachers said they'd either left or were considering leaving the profession because of poor behaviour that they were having to handle. Now that harms children, that harms young people, because with fewer teachers and fewer good people in the profession, young people suffer because they don't have the benefit of those teachers. And we're seeing that day in and day out. It's probably the single greatest concern of most teachers in schools, and the single most important reason why teachers leave the profession. So absolutely, it's a serious issue on that level. But the kind of sensationalism that this media report, creates is not particularly helpful either, because it doesn't really inform people about what's going on day to day, which is that not usually as serious as this, but it is obviously still a concern that moderate levels of violence are present in our schools.
I agree. I'm going to interject again, because I just want to talk again about our show sponsors. So Hachette Learning. This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit www.hachetteLearning.com to explore the full range of titles. And then AQA, who know that teachers are the real experts in the classroom. That's why they work closely with teachers like you, combining your insight with their assessment expertise to create resources, tools, training and guidance that genuinely make a difference. They're the UK's most chosen assessment organisation, so chances are you already know their work. And as we head into a new school year, AQA are focused on helping teachers feel supported and ready. If you want to find out more about how they're working with teachers like you, just head to their website or search AQA, We Work with Experts. And if I could, so the first thing, while you were talking, both of you, I had a quick look through the article again just to see, and it did say that student had been excluded from lessons. And I don't think that was as a result of his actions. I think he was already excluded from lessons, which, so something wasn't working there in the first place. But also something that I noticed was that it said later on that teaching unions in Wales have raised concerns about violence and bad behaviour at schools after other serious incidents. He said earlier this year, a 14-year-old girl was found guilty of attempting to murder 2 teachers and a pupil in a frenzied knife attack in a school in Carmarthenshire, and she was locked up for 15 years. I mean, you know, so I don't know whether there is a particular problem. It seems to imply that there are issues in Wales that have been flagged up by unions, not just media reports, that there maybe are some issues there that need to be looked at as well. You know, are there ways that the system isn't working that are creating situations like this? I don't know. I never saw anything this particularly this violent, certainly not towards a teacher, in the time that I did 10 years in my secondary school, and never saw anything like this. But I heard reports of students throwing chairs at teachers' heads and things. So there are some issues, but I wonder if it's worse in Wales.
I think there's, but there's also issues in Scotland as well. I'm not saying that England is devoid of them. There's been strikes. I think it was the Isle of Wight, possibly. I can't remember which.
Yes.
Like one of the, yeah. So we're strikes there as well. And I think I think part of the problem is that we don't seem to have a very realistic idea of how it is that we go about things. We have got a small number of children who I think would benefit sometimes from a different environment. I think it's unrealistic for to say that every single child is going to succeed in mainstream school. I don't think they ever have. I think there are lots of children who dropped out quite early, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, who just didn't carry on. It just wasn't, you know, it wasn't the right environment for them, but the way that it was dealt with was different. However, there's also the issue. So sometimes we are putting children into a situation which is going to be distressing for them, because that environment, particularly that big, you know, secondary school environment, does not work for everybody. I'll say, you know, I struggled with it. I did not like secondary school particularly because it was too big for me. And I did love my teachers, and I'm still, you know, grateful to my secondary school. But if I'm honest, I preferred primary and I preferred sixth form, and I actually like if I look at my courses since, they've been relatively sort of smaller and contained, because actually I found that better for me, like in terms of like being more personable and getting on with it, rather than being part of this vast thing all the time, which is fine. But you know, I can cope with that in small doses. But I can understand why it might lead in a different path. Like, so for me, it probably just made me shyer and a bit more withdrawn. But for other people, it will lead them down a slightly different path. So there's nothing wrong with saying that we do need a variety of schools. So for all that we do our absolute best to include children, I think the people who call themselves pro-inclusion need to sometimes stop and think, actually, are we by advocating for what we're advocating, trying to make mainstream, you know, like make it all things to all people, are we actually doing the right thing here? I think that's got to be a debate. Secondly, I think we've also got to stop and think about the kind of approaches that we do have. Like, what is whole school? What is the norm for the vast majority of the children need? Because when that breaks down, you end up with the most extreme behaviour from the children, who may still need reasonable adjustments, but actually what you end up with is not children getting reasonable adjustments. You end up like this, you know, this falling apart of the system, because there's too many exceptions being made, but those exceptions are not working. So if we're talking about making reasonable adjustments, I think we also need to stop and think, are they working? You know, are they actually working? Because there's two types of adjustments you can make. You can just cave in constantly to the child, because actually you're not really thinking about what it is they need. It's just in the moment, you cave in, you give in, you let them wear their cap, you let them break the rule, you let them whatever, right? But actually the impact that's having is not actually to make that child feel any safer and secure, because all it does is they've crossed a boundary and now they're feeling actually insecure, and they keep crossing boundaries. And we know who those children are. They will just keep pushing for the next thing. Whereas you've actually got what are actual genuine reasonable adjustments, where you do meet the need of a child. And I'll give a good example of this child who could get very agitated, wasn't violent, could get very agitated, really nervous, anxious and because they just needed a visual timetable, and what they needed was to have that visual timetable at the beginning, at the front of the class, and for them to be sat facing it. That was literally what it was required. Now, the alternative to doing that was actually that child would be agitated. They'd just be, because they just didn't know what was going on, and they felt like they had needed that reassurance of that visual timetable, like, I know what's happening in my day. Now, to me, that's like a small adjustment that you can make, but it worked, okay? Whereas there's other things that have happened which blatantly didn't work, and like I said, did not improve the behaviour of the children. And we do need to have an honest discussion about this at all levels. How are we actually analysing the decisions that are being made at all levels, teacher, SLT, even higher than that? And are are we sort of going for certain options because that's what suits that person's personality, but doesn't actually have the impact? And if we're seeing that certain types of adjustment don't have the impact, we need to stop using them and stop encouraging to use them as well. It's not about how nice the idea is. The visual timetable is not the nicest idea that you could have come up with for that child, but it was the right idea.
I think it's true to say that whatever the rights and wrongs of the causes of these things, and it's certainly true that in wider society, particularly in the 2 or 3 years after the pandemic, there was a sharp rise in antisocial behaviour, which is documented through lots of other statistics, and that's outside of school. So it's not just a school-specific issue, it's a wider societal issue. But nevertheless, there has to be 2 red lines. And I'll repeat that because I think it is so important for the well-being of staff and therefore young people. Because if teachers are harmed, young people are harmed. Because ultimately, teachers make sure that schools are safe places to be. So red line number 1 is that you should always have a situation where young people can learn in a calm and safe environment. And red line number 2 is that no member of staff in a school should come to work expecting or fearing that they will be attacked or abused. Those things are not acceptable. But once you go beyond that, of course, and you know that that's the bottom line, then you can start thinking about the causes of things.
I think that's a really good point. Do you know, there was another thing that struck me in the article, is it pointed out it was an all-through school, which I think started at age 3, and I can't remember if it finished at 16 or 18. But, we have here in Somerset, we still have some middle school systems, pockets of those in place, which they're trying to eliminate. But I don't know anything really about how they work in terms of educational outcomes and the expense of them and all of those things. But certainly, I think splitting those children up in their age groups, in those sort of similar age groups, has always appealed to me. When I started secondary school, I looked about 5 or 6. I was really small. I was really puny. I looked really young. And there were girls with, sort of who were women, full-blown women with, sort of hairstyles and earrings and, wearing bras. And it was such a difference, and I imagine for boys that's a very similar sort of thing that they face, feelings, but boys tend to be more impressed by that sort of older, well, I suppose all of the kids are, and try to emulate that. And maybe that middle school system, it said there was a younger child, a girl who was younger, it said, who saw it, who witnessed it, and it doesn't say how much younger, but are we offering that protection in some schools from children seeing that kind of behavior? Would it be better, like you said, year 8 would have more meaning if it was the oldest year in the school? So I don't know, but I've just thrown a rabbit in, or a cat on the table or whatever, or taken us into a different direction. I appreciate that, but I just noted that it said it was an all-through school, and how safe is that as a system, I wonder.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and that debate has been rolling on for years, and I think will continue because there's no right or wrong. There are, I think, points for and against the system. I've worked in both. I've worked in upper schools where 14 to 18 or 14 to 19 for a lot of my career. I've also worked in secondary 11 to 16. I've not worked specifically in a middle school situation because, as you say, they've become they've been out of vogue for about the last 10 or 15 years. A lot of authorities have restructured them. But I think there is a case there. I think there is an argument there. And it's certainly one that needs consideration. But I suspect that's a debate for another day.
Yes.
So I think we're getting towards the end of today's show. I think the main things that we can say about the question of violence in schools is that it remains an issue and it remains a contentious point. And clearly, a lot of people are still very uncomfortable with behaviour in schools and feel that things have to be done. But to what extent anybody has the answers, well, therein lies a different question. So I think does anybody want to say anything more about violence in schools before we finish?
No, not within 1 or 2 minutes. It's a massive.
Yeah, no, I don't know. That's a much wider conversation, but yeah, no, I think we've made a good start.
Great. Okay. Well, in that case, then I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for listening today to Points of
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.